There's a generation nobody talks about. Not the boomers. Not the millennials. Not Gen Z. They're sandwiched in between. Quietly working. Raising families. Running companies. But here's what's strange. They prefer it that way. Gen X doesn't want the spotlight. They don't need constant validation. And psychologists find this fascinating. Gen X came home to empty houses. Both parents worked. There was no supervision. No structured activities. Just a key around their neck. And hours alone. Psychologists call this the Latchkey phenomenon. And it rewired their brains in specific ways. When you're alone as a child, you develop different coping mechanisms. You learn self-soothing. You become resourceful. You don't wait for adults to solve problems. Gen X learned to entertain themselves, fix their own snacks, handle boredom without stimulation. This created what researchers call premature independence. They grew up fast. Too fast, some would say. But here's what's interesting. It also made them incredibly adaptable. Gen X doesn't panic easily. They've been handling things solo since age 7. They don't need hand-holding. They don't require constant feedback. This shaped their workplace behavior, their parenting style, their entire approach to life. They trust themselves more than systems, because systems weren't there when they needed them. The Latchkey effect isn't just nostalgia. It's foundational psychology. Gen X doesn't believe what they're told. Not automatically. Not without proof. This drives other generations crazy. But there's a reason for it. Gen X watched institutions fail. Repeatedly. They saw parents get laid off after decades of loyalty. They watched the government lie about wars. They saw corporate promises evaporate. Every major institution betrayed their trust during formative years. So psychologically, they adapted. They developed what's called healthy skepticism. It's not cynicism. It's different. Cynicism is believing nothing matters. Skepticism is verifying before trusting. Gen X questions everything. Marketing claims, news headlines, expert opinions. They were the first generation raised on advertising saturation. They learned to see through it. This makes them excellent critical thinkers, but difficult to persuade. They don't follow trends. They don't jump on bandwagons. They watch. They wait. They decide for themselves. This psychological defense mechanism served them well. Through recessions, through broken promises, through constant change, skepticism became their superpower. Gen X figures things out. No YouTube tutorials when they were young. No Google searches. No asking the internet. If something broke, they fixed it. Or they learned how. This created what psychologists call problem-solving resilience. Gen X doesn't immediately seek help. Their first instinct is to try solving it themselves. This shows up everywhere in their behavior. At work, they troubleshoot before calling IT. At home, they attempt repairs before hiring professionals. It's not stubbornness. It's conditioning. They were raised in an era where information wasn't instant. Help wasn't one click away. So their brains developed different neural pathways. Patience. Trial and error. Persistence. Modern research shows this builds genuine competence. And confidence. Gen X trusts their own abilities. Because they've proven them repeatedly. They don't fear failure the same way. Failure was just part of figuring things out. This DIY psychology makes them self-sufficient. Sometimes to a fault. They struggle asking for help. Even when they should. Because independence isn't just a value. It's their identity. Gen X doesn't talk about their feelings much. Not because they don't have them, but because they learned early that nobody was coming to process emotions with them. Therapy wasn't normalized in their childhood. Mental health wasn't discussed. Feelings were private. So they developed what's called emotional self-regulation. They handle their own emotional states, process things internally, move on quietly. Other generations see this as bottling up, as unhealthy repression. But psychologically, it's more nuanced. Gen X learned emotional independence. They don't require external validation for their feelings. They feel things deeply. They just don't broadcast it. This makes them seem cold sometimes. distant, unaffected. But that's misreading them. They're processing, just privately. Research shows this can be healthy in moderation. It builds internal emotional strength. The challenge comes when they need support but won't ask for it. Gen X assumes they should handle everything alone, including pain, including grief, including stress, because that's what they've always done. This emotional self-reliance is both their strength and their struggle. Gen X communicates in layers. Sarcasm, irony, self-deprecating humor. It's not meanness, it's protection. Psychologists recognize this as defensive irony. When you grow up unsupervised and uncertain, sincerity feels vulnerable. So Gen X learned to coat everything in humor, especially the things that matter most. They rarely say what they mean directly. There's always a joke, a reference, a layer of distance. This served them well in an unstable world. If you don't take things too seriously, they can't hurt you as much. But it also creates communication barriers. Younger generations sometimes can't tell when Gen X is joking. Older generations think they're disrespectful. Gen X is simply speaking in their native language. The language of nothing is sacred, because when everything felt uncertain, taking things too seriously seemed naive. Irony became their shield, their way of engaging without full exposure. Understanding this unlocks Gen X communication. They care deeply, they just won't show it straight. The joke is the tell. The sarcasm is the sincerity. Gen X doesn't respect authority automatically. You have to earn it, with competence, with consistency. Titles don't impress them. Credentials don't guarantee trust. This comes from deep psychological conditioning. Gen X watched authority figures fail spectacularly. Politicians lied. Corporations collapsed. Institutions crumbled. Their parents worked loyally for companies that showed no loyalty back. So Gen X developed what researchers call earned respect orientation. They judge leaders by actions, not positions. This makes them difficult employees sometimes. They question bad decisions. They push back on poor leadership. But it also makes them excellent managers, because they lead by example, not by rank. Gen X bosses don't demand respect. They demonstrate competence. They don't micromanage. They don't need control, because they learned early that authority doesn't equal correctness. This anti-authority wiring runs deep. It's not rebellion. It's discernment. They'll follow great leaders anywhere, but they'll quietly undermine incompetent ones. It's a psychological filter developed through experience. Through disappointment, authority must prove itself. Every single time. Gen X lived in two worlds. They remember rotary phones, and they built the internet. They wrote letters, and they wrote code. This makes them psychologically unique. They're what researchers call digital immigrants with native fluency. Unlike boomers, they adapted to technology easily. Unlike millennials, they remember life without it. This gives them perspective and balance. Gen X uses technology, but they don't worship it. They remember face-to-face communication, real privacy, boredom without screens. So they engage with digital life differently. They're on social media, but less obsessively. They text, but they'll still call. This dual-world experience created cognitive flexibility. Their brains adapted to massive technological change and survived it. Research shows this kind of adaptation builds mental resilience. Gen X proved humans can rewire, can learn new systems, can bridge completely different eras. They're living proof of neuroplasticity. And they did it without instruction manuals, without digital natives to teach them. They just figured it out. Like everything else, the analog to digital bridge runs through their psychology. Here's the paradox of Gen X psychology. They value independence intensely, but sometimes it tips into isolation. They were trained to not need people, to handle everything alone. This created strength, but also loneliness. Psychologists see this pattern clearly. Gen X has fewer close friendships than other generations. They reach out less. They ask for help rarely, not because they don't want connection, but because needing people feels uncomfortable. Vulnerability wasn't modeled in their childhood. Interdependence wasn't taught. So they default to self-sufficiency, even when it hurts them. This shows up in midlife especially. Gen X struggles with the concept of community support, of leaning on others. They'll help anyone. But accepting help feels like weakness. Modern research shows humans need connection. Isolation damages mental health. Gen X knows this intellectually, but emotionally, it's hard to override decades of conditioning. Their challenge now is learning that independence and connection aren't opposites. That strength includes knowing when to reach out. It's their hardest psychological work. Gen X has survived everything. Economic crashes, multiple recessions, technology revolutions, cultural shifts. They graduated into the worst job market, bought houses at peak prices, weathered 2008, pivoted through COVID, and they just adapted. Psychologists call this adversity-based resilience. Gen X doesn't expect stability. They expect change. So they stay flexible. They learn new skills. They pivot constantly. This isn't optimism. It's pragmatism. They don't believe things will work out. They believe they'll figure it out when things don't. This creates a specific psychological profile. Low expectations, high capability, constant readiness. Gen X doesn't get shocked by disruption. They've lived through too much. Job loss? They'll retrain. Industry collapse? They'll shift. This adaptability is their superpower. But it's also exhausting, because they never feel settled, never feel secure. There's always another change coming, another adaptation required. Research shows this creates resilience, but also chronic stress. Gen X is tough, but they're tired, and they rarely admit it. Gen X is always in between boomers and millennials, between old ways and new ways, between ignored and overlooked. And psychologically, this shaped them. Being in the middle means being invisible, not quite one thing or another. Too young to be taken seriously by boomers, too old to relate to Gen Z. This created what researchers call middle child syndrome on a generational scale. Gen X learned to operate without recognition, without praise, without attention. They don't expect credit. They don't seek validation. They just do the work. Quietly, competently. This makes them undervalued. In workplaces, in culture, in conversations about generations. But it also makes them free. They're not performing for approval. They're not chasing likes or legacy. Gen X operates outside the validation economy. This is psychologically liberating, but also isolating. They're doing important work, holding things together, bridging gaps, but nobody's watching. Nobody's thanking them, and they've learned to be okay with that. Most of the time, Gen X parents are different. They're not helicopter parents. They're not free-range extremists. They're somewhere in between, letting kids struggle, but being available. This comes from their own childhood psychology. Gen X was undersupervised, so they supervise their kids more, but not too much. They remember the value of boredom, of figuring things out, of independence, but they also remember the loneliness, the feeling of being too alone. So they created a different approach, what researchers call supported independence. Gen X parents give kids freedom, but within limits. They don't solve every problem, but they're present. They teach resilience by letting kids fail, but catching them when it matters. This parenting style produces different outcomes. Gen X kids have more grit than some generations, more self-sufficiency, but also more access to support than Gen X had. It's corrective parenting, taking what worked from their childhood, fixing what didn't. Gen X doesn't parent from books. They parent from experience. Their own childhood was the case study. Gen X in the workplace is fascinating. They're not ambitious like boomers, not idealistic like millennials. They're practical. They get things done. Industrial psychologists notice distinct Gen X patterns. They don't need vision statements. They need clear objectives. They don't want team-building exercises. They want competent colleagues. They won't work for free pizza or exposure. They want fair compensation. This comes from psychological realism. Gen X watched loyalty mean nothing, saw pensions disappear, experienced layoffs. So they approach work transactionally. Not coldly, just honestly. They'll give their best work. But they won't give their identity. They keep boundaries between work and life, between professional and personal. This seemed cold to boomers, seems uninspired to millennials, but it's psychological protection. Gen X won't be exploited, won't be fooled by corporate family rhetoric. They show up, do excellent work, leave on time, no guilt, no apology, because they learned early that companies aren't loyal. So why should employees be? It's survival psychology, adapted for modern work. Gen X built the modern world. They created Google, Amazon, PayPal, YouTube. They wrote the code, designed the systems, built the platforms. But somehow they're not part of the narrative. The boomer innovation story ends. The millennial disruption story begins. Gen X is the gap between them, doing the actual work. Psychologically, this is revealing. Gen X doesn't need the credit story. They just need the thing to work. They're not building personal brands. They're building actual products. This comes from their core psychology. Process over performance. Substance over style. Gen X changed music, fashion, technology, work culture. But they did it quietly, without manifestos, without publicity campaigns, just through doing. This makes them historically undervalued, but psychologically consistent. They don't care about the narrative. They care about the outcome. Research shows this produces different motivation patterns. Internal drive, intrinsic satisfaction, competence-based reward. Gen X isn't working for applause. They're working because that's what you do. The psychology of invisible impact. So what's the psychology of Gen X ultimately about? It's about a generation that raised itself and survived. They didn't have support systems, so they became the support system. They didn't have emotional guidance, so they figured out their own emotions. They didn't have stability, so they learned to adapt. Psychologists will study Gen X for decades because they represent something unique, a natural experiment in independence. What happens when a generation gets minimal structure? Minimal supervision? Minimal institutional support? Gen X is the answer. They became self-reliant, skeptical, adaptable, resilient, sometimes to a fault, sometimes at a cost. But they made it through economic disasters, through cultural shifts, through technological revolution, and they did it quietly, without complaining, without needing recognition. That's the deepest psychological truth about Gen X. They don't need you to understand them. They don't need validation or visibility. They're fine being overlooked, being underestimated, being forgotten, because they learned early that nobody's coming to save you. You save yourself. And that's exactly what they did.